On the 6th of March 1940, 4 Finnish soldiers carried a body out of the woods near Ulismaa and set it down beside the others. Nobody hurried. There was no reason to hurry. The man's face was gone below the left cheekbone. His jaw had been torn away, and what was left of it had frozen into the collar of his snowsuit. The stretcher party had seen enough men that winter to know the difference between a wounded man and a dead one, and this was a dead one. One of them said later that half the head was simply missing. They laid him with the others who would go back on the sledges, and they went to find the next casualty, because at Kollaa in March of 1940, there was always a next casualty. Then the corpse moved. Not much. A twitch of one hand. Enough that somebody swore and shouted, and enough that instead of going back on a sledge, he went back on a stretcher, and instead of a grave detail, he got a field surgeon. They did not save his face. It would take 26 operations over several years to build him something he could eat with, and even then he would spend the rest of his life with a jaw made partly from bone taken out of his own hip, and a look on the left side that made children stare in the street. What they saved was a 34-year-old corporal from a farming municipality on the Russian border, a man of about 5'3", who in the previous 98 days had killed more enemy soldiers with a rifle than any human being before or since. His name was Simo Häyhä. The Red Army had another name for him, and it was the kind of name armies only invent when they are frightened. The White Death. Here is the part that everyone gets wrong about him. When you hear a number like 500, your mind builds a certain kind of man. It builds a killer. Some cold, hollow professional produced by a military system designed to produce exactly that. Some prodigy of violence. Simo Häyhä was a short, quiet, extremely polite farmer who liked dogs. He was born in December 1905 in Rautjärvi, a scatter of farms and lakes in what was then the Grand Duchy of Finland, part of the Russian Empire. He was the 7th of 8 children. His family were smallholders in the way most Finns of that generation were smallholders, which is to say they farmed because that was what there was, and they hunted because meat was expensive and the forest was free. He left school after the compulsory years and went to work on the family land. That is the entire first 2 decades of his life. There is nothing in it that predicts anything, except for one habit: Simo shot. Constantly. He was a member of the Suojeluskunta, the Civil Guard, a nationwide volunteer militia that had grown out of Finland's independence struggle and its civil war. The Civil Guard did drill and readiness training, but mostly, in practice, in a country full of hunters, it ran shooting competitions, village against village, parish against parish, Sundays with a rifle and a paper target and 100 neighbors watching. He won. Then he kept winning. By his mid-20s, the cupboard in his farmhouse had run out of room for the trophies, and the story that circulated for the rest of his life was that he had to start stacking them on the floor. That detail sounds like the sort of thing that gets invented afterwards, but it was reported by people who had been inside the house, and it fits the man. He did not talk about the shooting. He simply did it, every week, for 20 years, in the same forests, in the same weather, at the same ranges, until the act of putting a bullet where he was looking stopped being a skill he performed and became something closer to a reflex he could not switch off. He did his national service in 1925 in Bicycle Battalion 2 and was discharged as a corporal. That is the whole of his military career before the war. 1 year of conscription and a rank you can earn by showing up on time. The Red Army, when it came, had generals with academies behind them, staff colleges, doctrine, artillery schools, and the largest tank fleet on Earth. What it did not have, anywhere in its enormous inventory, was a countermeasure for a man who had spent 2 decades learning exactly how far away things were in the woods behind his house. The war began with a lie, which is not unusual, and with a number, which is. On the 26th of November 1939, Soviet artillery shelled the Soviet village of Manila, and Moscow announced that the Finns had done it. Finland offered a joint investigation. Moscow refused, renounced the non-aggression pact, and 4 days later the Red Army crossed the border on a front that ran from the Gulf of Finland to the Arctic Ocean. The arithmetic was not close. It was not even in the same category as close. The Soviet Union had a population somewhere near 170 million. Finland had a little over 3.5 million, and could field, at full mobilization, an army of roughly 300,000 men, many of them in uniforms they had brought from home. The Finns had a few dozen serviceable tanks. The Soviets committed thousands. Finland's air force could put up perhaps 114 combat aircraft. The Soviets flew several thousand sorties in the first week alone. There were Finnish units with one anti-tank rifle per company and units with none. Stalin's staff had planned for a campaign of about 2 weeks. They had printed propaganda leaflets in Finnish. They had assembled a puppet government at Terijoki under Otto Kuusinen, ready to be installed in Helsinki once the shooting stopped. Some Soviet units were instructed to be careful not to stray across the Swedish border by accident, which tells you exactly how far and how fast the planners expected them to go. Military attachés in London and Paris made the same prediction in more diplomatic language. Finland would last a fortnight. What the planners had measured was mass. What they had not measured was the specific problem of moving mass through a Finnish forest in December, because here is what the map did not show them. There were almost no roads. The country the Red Army was invading was a lattice of frozen lakes, bog, and dense pine, cut by a handful of narrow tracks. An armored column on one of those tracks is not a spearhead. It is a snake in a corridor, and it can only be as fast as its slowest vehicle, and it cannot deploy sideways, and every man in it is standing in the open with trees 10 meters away on both sides. The Finns worked this out immediately and built an entire style of war around it, cutting columns into segments with felled trees and ski troops, then killing each segment separately over days while it starved and froze in place. They called those trapped segments madis, from the word for a stacked cubic meter of firewood, which tells you something about the Finnish sense of humor. And then there was the cold. The winter of 1939 into 1940 was the harshest in living memory. Temperatures on parts of the front dropped past -40. At that point, the distinction between Celsius and Fahrenheit stops mattering, because the two scales meet there, and so does the distinction between an army and a crowd of men trying not to die. Diesel gelled, weapon oil thickened into paste, metal stripped skin. Soviet units arriving from Ukraine and Central Asia had never experienced anything remotely like it, and were, in many cases, not equipped for it at all. Tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers were treated for frostbite that winter. Men fell asleep and did not wake. The Finns were not warm. Nobody was warm. But the Finns were dressed for it, fed on it, born into it. And they had one further advantage that mattered more than any of the rest. They had grown up on the ground they were standing on. Simo Häyhä reported for mobilization and was assigned to the 6th Company of Jalkaväkirikmenti, 34, Infantry Regiment 34, which went into the line on the Kollaa River in Ladoga, Karelia. His company commander was a captain named Arne Juutalainen, a man who had spent 5 years in the French Foreign Legion in Morocco and had come home with a curved knife, a taste for the dramatic, and the nickname the Terror of Morocco. Later in the war, when a staff officer asked him whether Kollaa could hold, Juutalainen is supposed to have answered that Kollaa would hold, unless they were ordered to run away. Kollaa held. That is the short version of a story that deserves far more attention than it gets. The line was attacked continuously for over 3 months by units of the Soviet 8th Army, and it never broke. It was still holding on the day the peace treaty was signed. Understand what that line actually was, because the word front gives you the wrong picture. There were no trenches in the sense you are imagining. The ground was frozen a meter down and could not be dug without explosives, so Finnish positions were built up rather than cut in, out of logs and snow and whatever the forest gave them, with sleeping dugouts behind and a stove that could only be lit when the smoke would not show. Between the Finnish positions, there were often hundreds of meters of nothing but trees. The line was less a line than a series of held points with patrols moving through the gaps, which meant that at any given moment, nobody on either side was entirely sure where the other side was. At one rise on that front, a position the Finns took to calling Killer Hill, a force of somewhere around 32 Finns held against a Soviet attack estimated at 4,000. That number gets repeated so often that it is worn smooth, and it is worth stopping to feel it. 32 men, rifles, a couple of machine guns, and the terrain. They held, and the reason they held is the same reason the whole sector held. Attacking uphill through deep snow into interlocking fire, in a forest, with no room to bring armor around the flank, is a way of feeding a battalion into a funnel. That was the ground. Into it, in the first days of December, walked a corporal with a rifle and no scope. Let me talk about the rifle, because people get this wrong too. It was not a battered antique. Simo carried an M/28-30, a Finnish weapon built on the Mosin Nagant action, but very much its own thing. The Finns had inherited Russian rifles by the crate after independence, and had spent the 20s and 30s rebuilding them properly, with new heavy barrels from Finnish makers like Seiko and Tikkakoski, tighter chambers, improved bedding, and a rear sight redesigned for the kind of precision the Civil Guard competitions demanded. They nicknamed it the Pistikorva, the Spitz dog, because the front sight guard looks like a pricked-up ear. It was a target rifle wearing the body of a service rifle, and in the hands of a competitive shooter, it was superb. It had iron sights. Simo used the iron sights. He was offered a telescopic sight, and he did not want one. And to modern ears, that sounds like a man refusing a gift out of stubbornness. It was not stubbornness. It was a series of very specific judgments about a very specific environment, and every one of them was correct. Start with the glass. A lens is a mirror that hasn't made up its mind. Point it anywhere near a low winter sun over open snow, and it will throw a wink of light that a trained observer can pick up from several hundred meters. In a forest, in summer, on broken ground, that risk is manageable. On a white field in January, where the only things that are not white are men and trees, a flash of reflected light is the loudest thing on the battlefield. Soviet counter-snipers were taught to look for exactly that. It was the first thing they looked for. Second, the height of the thing. To use a scope, you have to build your head up behind it. The optic sits above the bore. Your eye sits behind the optic. And the whole assembly forces your skull 2 or 3 inches higher than it would otherwise be. 2 or 3 inches sounds like nothing. Lying in a scrape in the snow with a Soviet company 200 meters away, 2 or 3 inches is the difference between a shape and a silhouette. With iron sights, Simo could put his cheek down on the stock and get his eye almost onto the line of the barrel itself. His profile from the front was a rifle muzzle and the top curve of a white hood. Third, and this is the one that killed men that winter, breath. In -40, every exhalation flashes into visible vapor instantly. It hangs. It rises. A man lying still in cover is invisible, right up until the moment he breathes, and then a little gray plume climbs out of the snow like smoke from a chimney and announces him. Soviet observers learned to scan for it. Finnish snipers died because of it. A scope makes this worse, because the optic sits directly in the path of the vapor, so you fog your own sight picture at the exact moment you need it. Simo's answer to that was to hold snow in his mouth. Not as a trick, as physics. The vapor condenses onto the cold, packed snow before it leaves your lips, and what does escape comes out cooler, thinner, and lower, and it does not climb. He also stopped his position from betraying him in the other direction. Before settling in, he would compact the snow in front of his firing point, sometimes wetting it so it froze into a crust. Loose powder in front of a muzzle is a smoke signal. The blast lifts it into a white cloud that hangs for several seconds, and anyone watching that sector now knows the shooter's location to within a meter. Packed and frozen, it stays where it is. And he went out early. Hours early, often before dawn, into a position he had chosen days before, and approached along a route that left as little trace as possible. Part of this was tactical, part of it was thermal. A warm man who lies down in fresh snow melts a shape around himself, and that shape is visible, and worse, it refreezes into ice that creaks. Get in early, get cold, stop being a source of heat, and the snow accepts you. None of this came out of a manual. There was no Finnish sniper doctrine in 1939 in any formal sense. Simo was doing what he had always done in those woods when he wanted to get close to an animal that could smell him, hear him, and see him better than he could see it. He was hunting. The only difference was that this time the animals were shooting back, and there were 4,000 of them. His method, once you strip away the mythology, was mostly discipline. He worked alone, usually without a spotter, which broke the practice most armies were moving toward. 2 men see more than 1 man. 2 men also make twice the noise, twice the vapor, and twice the target. Simo judged that in this ground the trade was not worth it. He memorized his ranges. This is the part that people underrate most, and it is probably the real answer to how a man with no magnification killed at 200 meters and beyond. Simo did not range find in the moment. He selected a position, then he learned the ground in front of it the way you learn a room in your own house. That stump, 150. The gap in the tree line, 180. The bend in the track where the snow was churned, 220. He set his sights for the distances that mattered, and he waited for men to walk into the numbers he had already solved. When a target stepped into a known range, there was no calculation left to perform. There was only the trigger. He fired very little from any one place. This mattered more than any other single habit. The Soviet answer to a sniper was not a duel. The Soviet answer to a sniper was an artillery battery. A shot from a tree line draws a fire mission, and a fire mission arrives in 15 or 20 minutes and removes a hectare of forest. Simo shot, and then he left, often crawling backwards, often after 1 or 2 rounds, and by the time the shells came down, he was several hundred meters away, watching the shape of the barrage tell him exactly what the enemy had concluded about his position. And he chose. He passed up shots constantly. A patrol moving properly, alert, spread out, with flankers, was not a target. A patrol moving fast because the men were frightened and wanted to be through the bad ground quickly, bunched up, heads down, was a target. Ammunition carriers were a target. Officers were the best target of all, and Finnish snipers learned to read Soviet rank at a distance not from insignia, but from behavior, from who walked in the middle, who turned to speak, who pointed. That is the whole system. Get in early, stay low. Do not glint, do not steam, do not lift the snow. Know the ranges before they matter. Shoot rarely, leave immediately. It is not complicated. Almost nothing about him was complicated. He was simply willing to do it perfectly, hour after hour, at -40, in the dark, day after day, for 3 months. The daylight, by the way, was almost nothing. At that latitude in December, you get somewhere around 5 hours of usable light, and it never really rises. The sun crawls along the treetops, and everything is lit sideways in a blue-gray that flattens distance. His entire working day was that window. He would go out in blackness, wait in blackness, work through the short gray afternoon, and come back in blackness. His diet during those months was, by his own later account, bread, butter, sugar, and whatever hot food could be brought forward without a cooking fire that would give away the position. He lost weight, he did not have to lose. Try to sit inside one of those mornings for a minute, because the numbers make it sound faster and louder than it was. It is 4 in the morning, and it is black, and the temperature is somewhere in the -30s. He eats cold. He checks the rifle, works the bolt, confirms the sights have not moved, and this is not a ritual. It is the fact that the entire operation depends on a mechanism that would rather seize than function. Then he goes out. The approach takes an hour to cover a distance he could walk in 8 minutes. Where there is cover, he moves slowly. Where there is not, he crawls, because a man upright against snow at any range is a black mark on white paper. He is not making tracks he cannot explain. He reaches the position he picked 3 days ago, a fold in the ground behind a fallen trunk with a stand of young pine behind it, so his outline never sits against open sky. He packs the snow in front of the muzzle. He puts a handful in his mouth. He gets down and arranges himself so that the only thing forward of the log is a few inches of barrel, and then he does the part that nobody makes videos about. He waits. For 2 hours, in the dark, at -35, without moving, while his body temperature drops to the point where the snow around him stops melting. Light comes up gray around 9. Nothing happens for an hour. Then a patrol, 8 men, walking a track 200 meters out. They are talking. You can hear voices a long way in that air. They are strung out and casual because this sector has been quiet, and it has been quiet because he killed a patrol here 4 days ago from a position 600 meters to the north, and quiet is what the Soviet reports say when nobody has survived to say otherwise. He lets the lead scouts go. He is watching the fourth man, who keeps turning his head to speak to the men behind him, which is a thing that men in charge do, and men being led do not. The fourth man walks into a gap in the trees that Simo already knows is 180 meters. One breath out, and stop. Squeeze. The crack goes flat across the snow, and the echo bounces off the tree line so that it seems to come from 3 directions at once. The man drops. The other 7 go down into the snow and start firing into a stretch of forest that has nobody in it. Simo is already going backwards. He does not watch. He knows. 20 minutes later, the artillery arrives and takes apart 400 meters of empty pine, and he is a long way off, lying still, watching where the shells fall, because the pattern of the barrage tells him exactly what the enemy believes. And what the enemy believes is wrong, which means he can use that ground again. The number began to build almost immediately, and it built faster than anyone believed at the time. Finnish practice was that a sniper's kills had to be witnessed, not claimed. Witnessed by other soldiers and reported up and entered in the company records. The tallies that survive for Simo Häyhä are not a man's boast, which is exactly what makes them strange, because a boast would be more modest. The figure most commonly given is 505 confirmed kills with the rifle in under 100 days. Some Finnish accounts put it at 542. Some historians argue for a lower confirmed count with a higher probable one. Alongside that, he did a great deal of close-range fighting with a Suomi KP/-31 submachine gun, and those kills, sometimes estimated at a couple of hundred more, are far harder to attribute and are usually counted separately or not at all. Argue about the last 50 either way, and it changes nothing. Even the most conservative reading leaves you with the highest confirmed sniper total in recorded warfare, achieved in 100 days, in the worst winter of the century, by a man who never used an optic. On the 21st of December 1939, which was Stalin's 60th birthday, the tally for Simo Häyhä in the company records was 25. 25 men. In one day. In 5 hours of light. Think about what that day actually was. It was not one long spree. It was a man lying in packed snow with snow in his mouth, taking a shot, moving, waiting, taking another, moving again, for the whole of a short Arctic day, in a sector under continuous attack, while the men around the ones he was killing shot back into the trees and called down artillery on the wrong grid squares. And this is where the story stops being about marksmanship and becomes about something else. Because the Red Army in that sector did not simply take casualties. It came apart at the seams. You have to try to inhabit this. You are a Soviet rifleman in the Kollaa sector in January 1940. You are cold in a way you have never been cold. Your unit has been in these woods for weeks, and has advanced almost nothing. There is a man out there. Nobody has seen him. Not once. Not a shape, not a flash, not a puff of vapor. Your friends do not die in firefights. They die in the middle of sentences. 1 second there is a man beside you carrying an ammunition box, and the next second there is a crack from somewhere in 400 degrees of white forest, and he is face down, and you do not know which way to point your rifle. And it happens again the next day. In a different place. From a different direction. Which means either there are dozens of them, or the one out there can be anywhere. Soviet units in that sector began refusing to move in daylight. Officers had to order men forward under threat, and then the officers started dying, which made it worse, because the ones giving the orders learned to stop standing up. Intelligence reports came back describing an exceptional sniper, and then multiple exceptional snipers, because nobody in the Soviet command structure could accept a single explanation. Somewhere in that process, in the reports and the rumors and the men talking in the dark, he stopped being a problem and became a story, and the story got a name: Belaya Smrt, the White Death. The Red Army responded the way large organizations respond. It escalated. First, they sent counter-snipers in ones and twos, then in dedicated teams, men with scoped rifles and proper training whose only job was to find and kill him. The story from the Finnish side is that they went out and did not come back, and that at least one of them gave himself away by exactly the flaw Simo had refused to accept in his own equipment. A wink of sunlight off a lens. There is an unpleasant symmetry in that. The Soviet counter-snipers were better equipped than he was. They had magnification, which meant they could identify a target he could only see as a shape. They had been trained in a system that took sniping seriously, and the Red Army's marksmen would go on to become some of the most effective in the world once they had learned the trade properly. What they did not have in that forest in that winter was the accumulated local knowledge of a man who had been shooting in those conditions since he was a boy. They were hunting an animal in its own territory using a manual written somewhere warmer. And here is the thing that makes the whole counter-sniper effort futile. To hunt a sniper, you have to find him, and to find him you have to look, and to look at that ground you had to be in it, in the open, at the wrong end of a rifle held by a man who had already been lying in the same spot since before dawn, and knew the exact range to every gap in the trees. The hunters kept arriving into a problem that had already solved them. Then they tried area fire. Artillery, mortars, and on several occasions strikes flown against stretches of forest, plastering the map squares where the shooting seemed to come from. There is an account of a barrage so heavy that Simo's greatcoat came back with fragment holes in it. He was still moving. Then, and this is the detail I find hardest to get out of my head, the Soviet command in that sector began ordering artillery preparation on the tree line as a routine precaution before movement, on the chance that he was in it. An army of millions, with an air force and thousands of tanks, was rearranging its daily procedure around one 34-year-old farmer with a bolt-action rifle and no radio. The Finnish command, meanwhile, was working out what it had. Word traveled up. On the 17th of February 1940, Lieutenant General Harold Öqvist presented Simo with an honorary rifle, a gift from a Swedish supporter of the Finnish cause. It is a very Nordic sort of decoration. No parade, no crowd. A senior officer comes forward to a company in the line and hands a corporal a rifle, and the corporal presumably says thank you and goes back to work. Mannerheim, the commander-in-chief, went further. Simo Häyhä was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant, jumping every rank in between, which is not a thing that happens in a functioning army, and had certainly never happened to a smallholder from Rautjärvi. He is often described as having risen further and faster in rank than any Finnish soldier of the war. He seems to have found the whole business faintly embarrassing. The end came on the 6th of March 1940, 7 days before the shooting stopped, and it came the way these things usually do. Not in a duel, not from a counter-sniper who had finally outthought him, from a bullet fired by somebody who almost certainly had no idea who he was aiming at. The round hit him in the left side of the jaw. Sources disagree about what exactly it was, an explosive bullet or a fragment, and the argument has never been settled. What is not disputed is the result. It took away the lower left of his face and a portion of his upper jaw and left him unconscious in the snow, which is where the stretcher party found him and made their reasonable, wrong conclusion. He was evacuated. He was operated on repeatedly by surgeons who were, at that point in the war, working through more casualties than they could count. He spent a week in a state somewhere below consciousness. He woke up on the 13th of March, 1940. That was the day the Moscow Peace Treaty took effect. The war he had fought for 100 days ended on the morning he opened his eyes. Finland lost about 11% of its territory, including the whole of the Karelian Isthmus and much of Ladoga Karelia. Roughly 420,000 Karelians, more than a tenth of Finland's entire population, packed what they could carry and left their homes rather than live under Soviet rule, and they were resettled across the rest of the country. Simo's own home district was inside the ceded area. He would never farm that ground again. Finland was not occupied. There was no puppet government installed in Helsinki. The 2 weeks the Soviet planners had allowed became 105 days, and the price was somewhere between 130,000 and 200,000 Soviet dead, against roughly 26,000 Finnish. The Red Army's performance in that winter was so poor, so publicly, that it fed directly into a set of assumptions in Berlin about how easily the Soviet Union could be knocked over. And those assumptions killed several million more people 18 months later. Now, about that number of his. We have it for one reason, and it is not because Simo Häyhä ever told anyone. He barely spoke about the war for 60 years, and when he did, he refused to describe individual kills. We have it because Finnish company clerks in freezing dugouts wrote things down. Witnesses named, dates recorded, tallies signed off by officers, and passed up a chain that had far more urgent things to do. The paperwork is the only reason we can say anything with confidence at all, which is worth sitting with. The only reason we can speak about Häyhä with any certainty is that somebody, in a frozen dugout, kept a record. Most families never get that. If yours has an American serviceman in it, a name, a photograph, a box of objects nobody ever explained, his paperwork exists too, scattered across archives that were never designed for you to find. I wrote a guide to finding it. It is called Find Your Grandfather's War, and it is linked in the description below, because the men who write nothing down disappear, and almost all of them wrote nothing down. What happened to Simo afterwards is, to me, the most interesting part of the whole story, and it is the part that never makes the thumbnails. He did not become a soldier. When the Continuation War began in 1941, and Finland went back into Karelia alongside Germany, Häyhä volunteered and was turned down. He was not fit. The jaw was not healed, the surgeries were not finished, and he would spend years in and out of hospitals while doctors rebuilt his face using bone taken from his hip. 26 operations, by the usual count. He could eat, eventually. He could speak, with difficulty, and the difficulty never entirely went away. Photographs of him after 1940 all have the same quality. A man turning very slightly so that the camera gets the right side. He went back to the land, which was the only thing he had ever wanted to do. The state resettled displaced Karelians on new holdings, and Häyhä took a farm at Ruokolahti in the southeast, near what was now the border. He grew crops, he kept dogs and bred them, he hunted moose, and he was good enough at it that he ended up on hunting trips with Urho Kekkonen, who would go on to be president of Finland for 25 years, which is one of those small facts that says a lot about the size of the country. He never married. He lived alone, mostly, in a small house, and he became the sort of local figure that villages produce, an old man everyone knew about and nobody bothered. Journalists found him occasionally. What they got was almost nothing, delivered politely. Asked how he had become such a good shot, he said, practice. Asked whether he regretted it, he said he had done what he was told to do, as well as he could, and that there would be no Finland unless everyone else had done the same. Asked what war had been like, he said something to the effect that it was not a pleasant thing, but that somebody had to protect the country, and it was not going to protect itself. That is the entire recorded philosophy of the deadliest sniper in history. He gave no speeches. He wrote no memoir, though a Finnish researcher eventually got enough out of him for a book. He kept no trophies from the war and did not, as far as anybody can tell, enjoy being asked about it. He is supposed to have said, late in life, that he slept perfectly well. He did not seem to mean it as a boast. He seemed to mean it as a plain answer to a question he had been asked too many times. He died on the 1st of April 2002 in a veterans nursing home in Hämeenä. He was 96 years old. A man who spent 100 days being hunted by an army, lived to see the Soviet Union collapse, and then outlived it by 11 years. So what do you actually take from this? The first thing is the smallest and the most useful, and it is that his advantages were not exotic. Everything Simo Häyhä did in that forest, someone could have written on a single sheet of paper before the war started. Do not carry glass that reflects. Do not lift your head. Do not breathe upward. Do not let your muzzle blast through snow. Learn the distances in advance, so you have nothing to solve when the moment arrives. Fire once, twice at most, then move before the guns can answer. Take the shot that is offered rather than the shot you want. Nothing in that list requires talent. The talent was in the shooting, and the shooting he had built himself over 20 years of Sunday competitions nobody outside Rautjärvi cared about. The rest was discipline, applied at -40, alone, for 3 months, without anyone checking. The second thing is what he tells you about the difference between equipment and understanding. The Red Army had better equipment than the Finns in every category that could be counted. It had more of everything. What it did not have was an understanding of the specific ground it was standing on, and against a man who understood that ground completely, all that mass converted into targets. There is a version of this lesson in almost every insurgency and every defensive war since, and armies keep relearning it, expensively. And the third thing has nothing to do with tactics. The Soviet soldiers in the Kollaa sector believed they were being hunted by a supernatural figure, and in a real sense they were right about the effect and wrong about the cause. The White Death was not a monster. He was a small, polite farmer who had learned to be very still, and who went home afterwards to grow potatoes, and breed dogs, and hunt moose for 62 years, and who, when finally asked what he had done, said only that he had done what he was told, as well as he could. I have thought about that answer a lot. It is either the most modest thing a man has ever said about himself, or it is the only sentence he could bear to say out loud. I do not know which, and I do not think anyone does. He would not have told you either. If this is your kind of story, this channel is full of them. Men and machines and decisions from the Second World War that got buried under the famous stuff, told properly and told slowly. Subscribe and turn notifications on so the next one finds you. And leave a comment with what you want covered, because a lot of what ends up on this channel starts in that comment section. Next time, we are going back to the same winter and the same forest, to the Finnish tactic that trapped entire Soviet divisions on a single road and killed them by the thousand without ever mounting a frontal attack. They named it after a stack of firewood. Thanks for watching.